The Ugly Carnival, which was carried out inside of France from summer 1944 to the end of World War II, was a harrowing and shocking spectacle that resulted in the public humiliation, torture, and even execution of some women who were accused of sleeping with the enemy. There was a huge amount of anger inside of the country, and the members of the French resistance wanted to subject those who collaborated with the Germans in any way to an ordeal which was public and shaming. They would shoot some of their enemies in front of thousands, but women who slept with the German soldiers who had occupied them were forcibly shaved, and some were tarred, some even covered in symbols associated with the German Reich. Inside of Paris, the anger towards women was incredible, and it was a show of terror. Even some Allied soldiers who witnessed these scenes could not watch, as the ordeal was too brutal and was too sadistic. But why was the Ugly Carnival worse than you think? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Throughout World War II, there were many countries and nations that found themselves invaded and occupied by the German forces throughout the conflict, and wherever invading forces went, they mixed with the local women. Some inside of these nations saw German soldiers as exotic and attractive, and they fell in love. At the end of the war in Britain, for example, there were many women who actually married the prisoners of war, those German and Italian enemy soldiers who had been put to work inside of POW camps or who worked on the farms in local areas. Inside of France, the country suffered a great deal, and because of this, the French resistance viewed any form of fraternisation with the enemy as one of the worst crimes that someone could commit. They viewed it as treason, and those women who slept with German soldiers were deemed to be negatively affecting the purity of the nation. Inside of France, roughly 200,000 children were born to French mothers and German fathers, and this was a trend inside of the occupied lands. Even on the Channel Islands, hundreds of German fathered children were born to local women. These children, in some regards, were looked down upon and were considered the product of the enemy. Some of these children were the result of abuse, as German soldiers carried out terrible crimes against locals. Others were the result of consensual relations and long-standing relationships. Some German men saw the French women themselves as exotic, and particularly inside of Paris, they visited many of the brothels, and they saw the city as a giant cat house where they could have their fun and do practically whatever they wanted. Some committed terrible crimes against those ladies of the night, and later at the end of the war, these women, despite being paid, were subjected to bad beatings. One thing to consider is that many of these French women thought that German men could provide them with a secure and happy future, and they wanted to begin families with the men they loved, like most people would. It was normal that many fell in love. Some at the end of the war left France and they went to live with their German boyfriends, and a few even chose to be locked up inside of prisoner of war camps with their partners who had been captured. But for the French resistance, the idea of sleeping with German soldiers, or horizontal collaboration as it was known, as in lying with the enemy, was viewed in a terrible manner. It was said to have been the most shameful betrayal of a country that a woman could partake in. Now, as different towns and cities were liberated from German occupation following the Normandy landings, the French resistance were empowered, and they fought the Germans back too, alongside Allied soldiers. They wanted to punish the women who had slept with the Germans, and with this, they carried out attacks upon the female populations of towns, villages and settlements that became known as the Ugly Carnival. It was public humiliation aimed to psychologically and physically hurt women who had slept with the enemy, and this spectacle shocked and disgusted many of the most battle-hardened Allied soldiers, men who were extremely tough and who had fought the Germans for many years. But they did learn about the suffering the French had been under, and they also learned why the Germans were hated so much. The Ugly Carnival was incredibly rough. In front of crowds of thousands and thousands of French people, women who were accused of sleeping with the enemy were gathered together and were displayed often on the back of vehicles. They were taken to public squares or prominent meeting spots, and they were then helped onto a raised platform. Whilst on this, they then had their heads shaved, being shorn with scissors in a very rough manner, which must have been painful. Women had all their hair shaved off, which dated back to the medieval period, and this was said to have been linked to the shaming of women for centuries in countries such as even Germany and France. After the head shaving, some women were covered in Nazi insignia to show what their crimes were, with swastikas painted on their foreheads, and some women were even tarred and feathered. After this, the women were paraded throughout the town, or they were forced to run the gauntlet through the angry crowds, which were often like a mob. As they did this and tried to get home, people kick and beat them, punching them as they went past. Others tried to trip them so they would be knocked onto the floor, and they would also be spat on. Some of the women were stripped half naked and were forced to walk barefoot, and inside of Paris, some women were so badly beaten that they actually died because of their ordeal. Many of the women had further swastikas drawn on them by women in the crowd in their lipstick, and it was incredibly dangerous. Missiles were thrown, some objects heavier than others, and one witness claimed about the victims that, in the hands of their tormentors, they had the look of a hunted animal. The Allied liberators documented what they saw, and one witness claimed the French were rounding up collaborators, cutting their hair off and burning it in huge piles, which one could smell miles away. Women collaborators were forced to run the gauntlet and were really beaten. These scenes were carried out all across French towns and cities, and also a number of men were subjected to the treatment too. This included men who didn't obviously sleep with the enemy, but were family members of women who did. Serious male collaborators and traitors were usually shot. In June, after the liberation of the town of Carentan, Allied soldiers witnessed a dozen French women being shaved in the town square. On the 14th of July 1944 in Cherbourg, a truck containing many teenage girls was driven through the streets, and these women had their heads shaved. In one French town, a woman who had worked as a cleaner in the German army's local headquarters in the town was shaved, and she didn't sleep with the enemy, but she'd just been cleaning the offices or barracks. Many of the victims of this punishment were those who had felt compelled to give their bodies to the Germans in order to get money or support from the occupiers. They thought this was the best way of ensuring that their children were fed and received better rations, and some thought that their children would starve if they did not get the help of the German officers. Another man who witnessed the Ugly Carnival claimed that, "I saw 4 girls who had been led through the streets, and I rushed towards them to take a photograph. At once I found myself at the front of the procession, and the local people thought I was the female soldier who had captured them or something like that, and I was kissed and congratulated at the same time as slaps and spits rained down on the unfortunate girls." Another witness said that, "I watched an open lorry drive past to the accompaniment of boos and catcalls from the French people, with a dozen miserable women in the back, every hair on their heads shaved off. They were in tears, hanging their heads in shame. Whilst disgusted by this cruelty, I reflected we British had not known invasion or occupation for some 900 years, so we were not the best judges." It's considered that there were at least 20,000 women who were subjected to the Ugly Carnival and were punished by public head shaving and beatings. Even women and their small children were paraded in shocking scenes. Simone Tussaud, a 23-year-old mother, was pictured running the gauntlet, with her mother, who had been shaved too, clutching her child in her arms, a son born to a German father, a man whom she had been in a relationship with for years. She had worked for the Germans as a translator, and the crowd tried to attack her. Her plight was so damning and harrowing that for the rest of her life she could not live with the shame of that day, and she later took her own life, following a stint in jail for the collaboration. It was clear that the Ugly Carnival had a huge and incredibly damaging lasting effect on its victims. So in France, in the final year of the Second World War, around 20,000 women were accused of sleeping with the enemy, and were punished by the Ugly Carnival, being shaved and beaten by the crowds. These women were seen as the worst traitors, and horizontal collaboration and lying with the Germans was viewed as insulting and disgusting, and it was seen as a dark stain on the purity of the country. The truth was that France had suffered significantly under German occupation. Large swathes of the population had been deported to concentration camps, and many who resisted the enemy were ruthlessly tortured or were executed by groups such as the SS or the Gestapo. For the French resistance, the women were seen as terrible betrayers of the land and of the country. But the punishment itself was sickening, and even turned the stomachs of the men who had fought to liberate France. There were some in the resistance who were opposed to this sort of punishment, and did try to discourage other resistance fighters to carry out the torture. But it was one of the darkest episodes of the Second World War and of the liberation of different countries from German occupation. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.